and in so many people's. I mean, even when I was in makeup just now, somebody came up almost crying, saying how much they...
Television studio lights blazed against the polished wooden desk as Earl Charles Spencer and Prince William stepped in front of live cameras holding a worn leather-bound volume bearing a faded royal crest. Inside those handwritten pages rested Princess Diana's final unvarnished accounts of palace manipulation, documents that Camilla had spent decades trying to keep locked away from the public eye. When William opened the cover and began reading the first explosive entry on national television, the absolute truth of past deceptions was revealed to millions of viewers, leaving Camilla completely shattered as the final walls of royal secrecy crumbled around her. The Althorpe Estate Archive recovery. Earl Charles Spencer walked down the dim stone staircase leading into the subterranean muniment room at Althorpe House. He held a brass lantern in his right hand. The yellow flame cast flickering shadows across the damp brick walls. He reached the bottom landing and stopped before a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. He pulled a heavy iron key from his pocket and slid it into the keyhole. The lock gave way with a deep, muffled click as he turned the brass tumbler twice. Securing private estate muniment rooms at Althorpe requires strict adherence to ancestral archiving protocols. When historical documents dating back centuries are stored within underground vaults, estate stewards maintain rigorous environmental controls to protect fragile parchment against dampness and decay. Charles pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside the cold chamber. Rows of mahogany shelving stretched out into the darkness on either side of the narrow aisle. He walked toward the far corner, where a large iron chest rested beneath a small ventilation grate. The lid of the chest bore a weathered brass plate engraved with the Spencer family crest. He knelt on the stone floor and lifted the iron latch. The lid rose slowly on rusted hinges, releasing a faint scent of aged paper and dried lavender into the air. Accessing ancestral manuscript chests involves careful inspection of exterior hardware seals to verify that unauthorized tampering has not occurred over decades of estate occupancy. Charles reached down into the depths of the iron chest and moved aside several layers of velvet protective cloth. His fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound volume, tucked beneath a packet of 19th century land deeds. He gripped the spine of the book and pulled it out into the lantern light. The cover was bound in dark green calfskin, with a faded royal monogram stamped in gold leaf along the bottom corner. It was Diana's personal diary from 1997. Preserving personal diaries recovered from ancestral vaults demands immediate stabilization procedures to prevent ink degradation and paper splitting upon exposure to ambient oxygen. An unexpected sound echoed from the stone corridor outside the muniment room. A heavy boot heel scraped against the flagstones near the bottom of the cellar stairs. Charles stood up abruptly, holding the leather-bound diary tightly against his chest. He turned his head toward the open oak doorway as a flashlight beam swept across the damp brick wall outside. A trusted estate security guard stepped into view, lowering his torch as he recognized the Earl standing in the dim light. Investigating unexpected noises during late-night archive recoveries requires swift identification of on-duty security personnel to prevent false alarms and maintain perimeter integrity. The security guard apologized for the sudden interruption, explaining that he was completing his routine midnight patrol of the lower foundations. Charles exhaled slowly and told the guard to secure the outer courtyard gates for the remainder of the night. The guard nodded, turned on his heel, and walked back up the stone steps, his footsteps fading away into silence. Charles looked back down at the leather volume in his hands, knowing that the physical proof was finally secure. Verifying guard patrol logs during private estate operations ensures that internal security protocols function seamlessly without disrupting confidential archival access. Charles slid the leather diary into a heavy canvas transport bag and snapped the brass zipper shut. He closed the iron chest and locked the heavy oak door behind him. He climbed the stone staircase back up to the ground floor, carrying the historic artifact toward his private study. The first major piece of the puzzle was now safely in his custody, setting the stage for the secret rendezvous with Prince William that would soon take place behind closed doors. The secret midnight meeting at Windsor. Prince William unlocked the side service door of Windsor Castle, using a brass key bearing an old royal crown hallmark. He pushed the heavy wooden portal open and stepped into the dim stone vestibule. The castle was dead silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock echoing down the long, vaulted corridor. Earl Charles Spencer, stood waiting beside a stone pillar near the base of the grand staircase. He held the canvas transport bag firmly in his right hand. William closed the door quietly behind him, locking the deadbolt with a single metallic turn. Charles walked over to William and placed the canvas bag onto a polished mahogany side table resting against the stone wall. He unzipped the brass slider and pulled out the dark green leather-bound diary with the faded gold monogram. The two men stood close together under the warm glow of a single wall sconce, looking down at the worn cover of the book. William reached out and touched the embossed royal cipher, noting the slight scuff marks along the bottom corner of the binding. An unexpected sound broke the quiet atmosphere when a heavy security door on the floor above clicked open. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed across the stone flagstones of the upper gallery. William raised his hand to signal silence, his eyes fixed on the shadow cast along the curved staircase above. Charles slid the diary back into the canvas bag halfway, his fingers gripping the zipper slider. A royal protection officer peered over the balcony railing, holding a small tactical flashlight down toward the vestibule. Managing unexpected encounters during confidential late-night briefings requires calm coordination with on-duty security details to prevent perimeter breaches from disrupting sensitive state tasks. The protection officer recognized the prince and lowered his flashlight, offering a polite nod of acknowledgement before stepping back into the upper hallway. The footsteps faded away as the officer resumed his patrol of the royal apartments. William let out a quiet breath and motioned for Charles to pull the diary out of the bag once more. He unclasped the metal strap holding the cover shut and opened the first page of the volume under the light of the wall sconce. Checking on-duty guard rotations during private archive inspections ensures that internal security patrols operate smoothly without compromising confidential document reviews. Charles pointed his finger toward a specific entry written in black ink across the middle of page 42. The date at the top of the page matched the final week of August 1997. Diana's handwriting detailed the exact names of senior household administrators who had orchestrated the covert transfer of charitable funds into private accounts. Every financial maneuver was laid out with precise dates, figures, and personal signatures. The evidence was undeniable and complete. Cross-referencing handwritten journal entries with historical bank records confirms the exact mechanisms of administrative fund diversions during late 20th century royal reorganizations. William closed the leather-bound volume and zipped it securely inside the canvas bag. He looked up at his uncle and gave a firm nod, signaling that the verification process was fully complete. They walked side by side toward the private study on the ground floor, carrying the explosive diary toward the final staging area before the upcoming live broadcast. The hidden truths of the past were now fully armed and ready to face the world. Entering the wood-paneled study, William set the canvas bag flat against the center desk, while Charles locked the heavy door from the inside. The room smelled of polished beeswax and old paper. Charles unzipped the bag again and slid the dark green diary out onto the green leather blotter. He opened the volume to the ribbon marker placed near the back pages. The entries detailed late-night meetings held inside Clarence House during the summer of 1997, recording specific names and transaction codes that had never seen the light of day. Reviewing primary source ledgers inside private study rooms allows investigators to correlate witness testimonies with handwritten personal notes, solidifying the evidentiary chain before public disclosure. William turned the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the precise ink strokes. He noticed several margin notes written in Diana's hand concerning administrative cover-ups orchestrated by senior household managers. The notes named specific individuals who had intercepted private correspondence and diverted charitable donations into unauthorized offshore accounts. Every detail aligned perfectly with the financial audit reports recovered from Highgrove House earlier in the week. The web of deceit was fully mapped out across the pages of the diary. Corroborating personal journal notes with independent financial audits establishes an airtight factual foundation, eliminating any doubt regarding the authenticity of historical revelations. A sudden rap on the study window startled both men. William turned his head toward the heavy velvet curtains draped over the tall sash windows overlooking the inner courtyard. A lone security operative stood on the gravel path below, signaling that the exterior perimeter remained clear of unauthorized personnel. William raised his hand in acknowledgement, and the guard stepped back into the shadows of the stone arcade. the brief interruption passed without incident, leaving the two men alone once more with the historic volume. Maintaining continuous exterior surveillance during high-stakes document reviews prevents external observation and safeguards the privacy of confidential estate proceedings. Charles flipped forward to the final written entry in the diary, dated August 31st, 1997. The sentences were sparse, penned with rapid strokes that pressed deeply into the paper fibers. The words conveyed a profound sense of urgency and a clear warning that if anything happened to her, the hidden records stored at Althorpe and Highgrove must be brought directly to light. William stared at the final line for a long time, tracing the letters with his finger. The mission was clear. The truth could no longer remain buried. Preserving final written warnings from historical figures provides vital emotional and factual context for subsequent investigations, framing institutional transparency as an absolute moral imperative. Charles closed the diary and slid it back inside the leather-lined transport case. He snapped the brass clasps shut and handed the case to William. The midnight meeting at Windsor Castle was officially concluded. The evidence was verified, the security protocols were executed, and the stage was set for the historic live television broadcast that would soon shatter decades of silence across the nation. Camilla's panic at Clarence House. Camilla stood alone in the dim quiet of her private study at Clarence House. She stared at the wall-mounted television screen glowing brightly across the dark room. The live news ticker scrolling along the bottom of the display flashed an urgent breaking alert regarding a scheduled joint broadcast by Prince William and Earl Charles Spencer. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. She reached down to the wooden surface and picked up her secure landline telephone to dial the direct emergency extension for her chief legal secretary. Monitoring live news feeds during major constitutional developments allows high-ranking officials to track breaking announcements in real time, enabling rapid administrative responses when confidential archives face imminent exposure. The telephone rang 3 times before a breathless voice answered on the other end of the line. Camilla spoke without a standard greeting, demanding to know why the High Court injunctions had failed to block the upcoming television broadcast. The legal secretary stammered an explanation, stating that the sovereign exemption orders signed at Buckingham Palace had legally bypassed all pending civil motions. Camilla slammed the handset back onto its cradle, shattering the plastic base along the side seam from the sheer force of the impact. Challenging executive sovereign orders through standard civil litigation remains ineffective when reigning monarchs invoke absolute constitutional prerogative over internal estate archives. An unexpected sound echoed from the heavy oak door leading out into the private hallway. A sharp knock rapped twice against the wood before the brass handle turned slowly downward. Camilla turned her head away from the television screen as her chief of staff stepped across the threshold, carrying a red priority folder. The staff member looked pale under the harsh overhead lights. He walked over to the edge of the carpet and reported that a convoy of media vans had just parked outside the front security gates of Clarence House. Managing unexpected staff intrusions during high-pressure crises requires immediate assessment of perimeter security to prevent unauthorized access to private residential quarters. Camilla motioned for the staff member to place the red folder down on the desk. She opened the cover with a quick flick of her fingers and scanned the typed memorandum inside. The document confirmed that all financial oversight committees had formally seized the remaining offshore accounts linked to her former administrative office. Every financial asset accumulated over the past 3 decades was now frozen under direct court order. The institutional safety net that had protected her for years had vanished completely in a matter of minutes. Executing asset freezes on disputed administrative accounts prevents the dispersal of questionable funds, while judicial investigations audit historical financial transactions. Camilla walked away from the desk and stood by the tall sash window looking out into the dark courtyard. The flashing blue lights of the media vans flickered against the damp stone walls outside the gates. She watched the live television feed reflected in the glass pane as the studio broadcast began to air across the nation. Earl Charles Spencer and Prince William appeared on screen holding the dark green leather-bound diary. The final walls of her protected world were collapsing in real time, leaving her entirely exposed to the unsparing judgment of history. Observing public media broadcasts from private residential windows illustrates the profound divide between secluded royal quarters and the unyielding glare of public accountability. Stepping back from the glass pane, Camilla walked across the Persian rug toward the corner drinks cabinet. She poured a small measure of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler and took a slow sip. Her eyes remained locked on the television screen, where the live broadcast showed the exterior of the BBC Broadcasting Centre. A news graphic displayed a live countdown timer, ticking down the final seconds before William and Charles Spencer began reading the diary entries aloud to the nation. The seconds seemed to drag on with agonizing slowness. Monitoring countdown clocks during major media events heightens the psychological pressure on individuals facing imminent public exposure and institutional dismantling. An unexpected flash of white light illuminated the dark study as a satellite news helicopter hovered low overhead, its searchlight sweeping across the upper windows of Clarence House. Camilla set her crystal glass down hard on the side table, spilling amber drops across the polished wood surface. She picked up the remote control from the center blotter and pressed the power button with an aggressive jab of her thumb. The television screen went black instantly, plunging the room into shadow, save for the faint glow of the street lamps filtering through the curtains. Intercepting aerial media surveillance during high-profile investigations requires specialized security countermeasures to preserve residential privacy against intrusive broadcast crews. Camilla turned away from the darkened television set and walked over to the stone fireplace. The grate was completely empty, stripped of any remaining papers following the security sweeps executed earlier in the week. She stood there in the quiet room, listening to the muffled hum of the media vans idling outside the perimeter gates down below. The administrative career she had spent decades building was entirely dismantled. Every hidden memo, every unrecorded financial transfer, and every suppressed diary entry was now out in the open air for the entire world to evaluate. Inspecting empty hearths after emergency evidence destruction highlights the finality of administrative collapse when physical documents are seized or burned beyond recovery. A soft chime sounded from the intercom unit mounted beside the study door. Camilla walked slowly across the room and pressed the talk button down with her thumb. Her chief of staff's voice came through the speaker, crisp and formal. He informed her that 2 senior representatives from the High Court Bailiff's office had just arrived at the front entrance bearing formal notice of immediate property receivership. Camilla did not answer the intercom. She released the button, stepped away from the wall, and walked toward the tall mahogany doors, ready to face the end of an era. Receiving court-appointed receivers at private residential entries marks the definitive conclusion of administrative autonomy, enforcing statutory compliance over compromised historical estates. Stepping onto the live television set, Prince William and Earl Charles Spencer walked through the heavy soundproof studio doors of the BBC Television Centre in London. 2 security officers followed closely behind them, carrying a locked steel briefcase containing the original green leather-bound diary of Princess Diana. The studio was brilliantly illuminated by rows of overhead spotlights casting a stark white glow across the polished concrete floor. Camera operators stood behind their pedestals, adjusting lenses and checking focus monitors. Absolute silence filled the room as the 2 men approached the main broadcast desk. Broadcasting studio protocols during major state announcements mandate strict physical security measures to protect historical artifacts while preparing live feeds for international distribution networks. William placed the steel briefcase flat against the glass-topped desk and flipped open the brass combination latches with 2 crisp clicks. He lifted the lid and pulled out the dark green diary, resting it squarely in the center of the desktop under the bright studio lights. Charles Spencer sat down in the leather armchair on the left side of the desk, adjusting his microphone clip along the lapel of his jacket. William took his seat on the right, resting his hands lightly beside the aged volume. The floor manager raised his right hand and began counting down the final 10 seconds before transmission. Countdown sequences preceding live national broadcasts require absolute coordination between studio floor managers and master control engineers to ensure seamless feed synchronization across global channels. An unexpected red warning light flashed on the master control monitor mounted against the far studio wall, signaling a momentary dip in the primary satellite transmission link. The senior technical director stepped forward from the control gallery door and whispered an urgent update to William, confirming that the backup fiber optic line had automatically engaged without signal loss. William nodded calmly, keeping his eyes fixed on the primary camera lens directly ahead. The technical hiccup resolved itself instantly, leaving the transmission path clear for the live broadcast to commence on schedule. Maintaining redundant broadcast transmission lines during high-profile state revelations prevents signal interruptions and guarantees uninterrupted delivery of historical evidence to millions of viewers. The floor manager dropped his hand to 0 and pointed his finger directly at the primary camera lens. The red tally light atop the camera flashed brightly, indicating that they were officially live on the air. William leaned forward toward his desktop microphone and looked straight into the camera glass. He began his opening remarks by stating that the physical evidence resting before them on the desk belonged entirely to the public domain. Every viewer across the country watched as the camera zoomed in sharply on the worn gold monogram stamped into the green leather cover. Initiating live television broadcasts with direct close-ups of primary physical evidence establishes immediate visual authenticity and captures viewer attention without relying on rhetorical embellishments. Charles Spencer took his turn speaking, turning his head toward the second studio camera positioned to his left. He described the exact conditions under which the diary had been recovered from the iron chest inside the muniment room at Althorpe House. He detailed the historical significance of the handwritten entries, emphasizing that the documents recorded events precisely as they unfolded during the summer of 1997. His voice remained steady and measured as he laid out the factual record for the national audience. Presenting factual recovery accounts during live historical broadcasts provides verifiable context that dispels speculation and it grounds public understanding in the documented reality. William reached out with his right hand and opened the cover of the green diary to page 42. The studio lights caught the ink reflections on the aged paper as he prepared to read the first unvarnished excerpt to the nation. The atmosphere in the studio remained completely motionless as the crucial moment of disclosure arrived. Millions of citizens sitting in living rooms across the United Kingdom held their breath, waiting for the long-concealed truths of the past to step out into the full light of day. Turning the aged paper page carefully, William adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat softly into the desk microphone. The studio operators maintained complete stillness as the prince began reading the handwritten lines, penned by Diana during the final week of August 1997. Every syllable resonated through the audio equipment and transmitted across thousands of relay stations across the Commonwealth. The names of the senior administrators involved in the financial diversions were spoken aloud on national television for the very first time. Broadcasting historical transcripts directly from primary source documents ensures that the exact wording reaches the public without editorial filtering or bureaucratic dilution. An unexpected audio feedback whistle hummed through the studio monitors for a split second before the audio engineer cut the faulty channel frequency. William paused mid-sentence, keeping his eyes fixed on the ink lines while the technical disturbance cleared itself. He resumed reading without missing a beat, his voice carrying an unyielding resolve that commanded the attention of every listener. The minor technical interruption vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the broadcast stream pure and undisturbed. Handling minor broadcast disruptions with immediate composure prevents audience distraction and preserves the solemn gravity of monumental historical disclosures. Charles Spencer listened intently as his nephew read through the final paragraphs of the journal entry. He placed his hand flat against the edge of the desk, his knuckles pale under the bright overhead fixtures. The precise financial transaction codes and offshore account numbers echoed across the airwaves, confirming every suspicion that investigators had harbored for nearly 3 decades. The institutional wall of silence was completely shattered, and the full weight of the evidence was now permanently embedded in the public record. Exposing detailed financial transactions during live national broadcasts validates years of investigative reporting and provides the definitive proof required for absolute systemic reform. William closed the green diary with a quiet thud that resonated through the desktop microphone. He looked up from the pages and stared directly into the center camera lens, addressing the nation with absolute finality. He stated that the era of hidden accounts and suppressed correspondence was officially over. The live broadcast reached its scheduled conclusion as the studio lights dimmed slightly and the credits began to scroll silently across the bottom of the television screens nationwide. Concluding live historical disclosures with definitive executive statements reinforces the permanence of institutional change and prepares the public for the legal restructuring that follows. Reading the uncensored truth to the nation, Prince William leaned slightly toward the central desk microphone. He turned the aged page of the Green Diary to a dog-eared corner bearing a small ink stain from August 1997. Millions of television screens across the United Kingdom displayed the exact handwriting in sharp, high-definition clarity. The studio lights hummed softly overhead, while the digital clock on the production wall ticked forward past 9 o'clock in the evening. William stated the full legal names of the senior household officers who had authorized the clandestine transfer of charitable funds into private overseas accounts. Broadcasting primary source evidence during live national news programs ensures absolute transparency and leaves no room for administrative denial. Earl Charles Spencer cleared his throat and shifted his position in the leather armchair. He picked up a secondary sheaf of authenticated papers detailing the offshore bank routing numbers registered in the Cayman Islands. He read the individual routing codes aloud into his lapel microphone without hesitation. Each sequence of numbers corresponded directly to the financial audit reports recovered from the iron chest at Althorpe House earlier that week. The stark financial reality laid bare on national television destroyed decades of carefully crafted institutional cover stories. Exposing unredacted financial routing codes on live television provides undeniable proof of systemic fund diversion within royal administrative departments. An unexpected flash of light cut through the studio windows from the television center courtyard outside. A satellite news van had just parked directly beneath the lower gallery exits. The floor manager signaled toward the control room that external reception metrics were surging past 40 million simultaneous viewers across the Commonwealth. William did not look up from the open pages of the diary. He continued reading the final paragraphs penned by Diana on the eve of her passing, detailing the systematic intimidation tactics used by palace aides to silence internal whistleblowers. Tracking audience reception metrics during major historical broadcasts highlights the unprecedented public demand for institutional accountability. Charles Spencer turned his head toward the second studio camera to address the Parliamentary Oversight Committee directly. He asked the assembled lawmakers what concrete legislative actions would now be taken to reclaim the £24 million stolen from the children's hospitals. His voice remained entirely level, devoid of emotional theatrics, anchoring every word to the concrete financial ledgers resting on the glass desk. The stark directness of the question sent immediate shockwaves through the political offices stationed around Westminster Palace. Directing factual inquiries toward legislative bodies during live broadcasts forces immediate parliamentary action on suppressed financial scandals. William closed the Green Diary with a firm, deliberate motion. The heavy thud echoed across the audio monitors into millions of homes. He looked straight into the camera lens and announced that all recovered charitable assets were already being transferred back into public trust accounts under emergency high court jurisdiction. The historic broadcast drew to a quiet close as the studio lights dimmed slightly and the credits began rolling across the screen. The absolute truth of the past was finally out in the open air, changing the course of the British crown forever. The aftermath and Camilla's breakdown. Camilla sat motionless on the edge of the velvet sofa inside her private drawing room at Clarence House. The television screen remained dark and silent across the room. Her hands rested flat against the floral fabric of her skirt. A copy of the morning edition of The Times lay abandoned on the Persian carpet near her feet. The front page headline featured a high-resolution photograph of Prince William holding the Green Diary during the live broadcast. The reality of the absolute collapse of her decades-old administrative shielding was sinking in with crushing weight. State newspaper front pages delivered definitive public documentation following major historical disclosures, permanently recording institutional reckonings for future generations. A sharp rap sounded against the heavy wooden door of the drawing room before it swung open slowly. Her chief legal counsel stepped across the threshold, carrying a thick stack of court-mandated asset seizure notices. He walked over to the low mahogany table and placed the papers down with a quiet rustle. He informed her that the High Court Financial Division had executed the final warrants freezing all domestic and international accounts linked to her former household office. Every avenue of financial defense had been completely sealed off. Executing court-mandated asset seizures enforces legal compliance and prevents the dissipation of disputed funds during comprehensive state investigations. An unexpected vibration hummed against the glass top of the side table as her personal mobile phone began to ring incessantly. Camilla did not turn her head to look at the screen, displaying the incoming caller ID from the Parliamentary Inquiry Board. The ringing continued for several long seconds before cutting off into dead silence. She looked down at the floor, where the newspaper headlines stared back up at her with unsparing clarity. The protective walls built over 30 years of careful maneuvering had vanished completely in a single evening. Ignoring official inquiry summons during administrative collapses signals the absolute surrender of disputed authority to governing oversight bodies. The legal counsel gathered his empty leather portfolio and offered a brief, formal bow before turning toward the exit. He walked out into the corridor and pulled the heavy door shut behind him, leaving her entirely alone in the quiet room. Camilla lowered her head into her hands as the final wave of emotional exhaustion overtook her composure. The public reckoning had arrived in full measure, sweeping away the last remnants of her guarded sanctuary and leaving her exposed to the judgment of history. Stepping slowly toward the tall sash windows, Camilla looked out across the manicured gardens of Clarence House. The gray morning mist hung low over the gravel pathways where media vans were still parked in tight clusters near the outer gates. A lone security officer stood beside the guardhouse, his arms crossed against the chilly breeze. She watched the distant traffic moving steadily along the mall, realizing that the ordinary world outside had continued spinning despite the seismic disruption of the previous night. Every familiar landmark of her royal existence now felt entirely alien and distant. An unexpected tap on the French doors leading to the interior terrace caused her to turn around sharply. Her personal secretary stood on the stone patio, holding a sealed manila envelope bearing the official wax seal of the Privy Council. Camilla walked across the parquet flooring and slid the brass latch upward to open the heavy glass door. The secretary handed over the envelope without speaking a word, his expression entirely devoid of the warmth that had characterized their professional interactions for over 2 decades. The final formal communication from the Crown had arrived. Camilla broke the red wax seal with her thumb and pulled out a single sheet of heavy parchment paper. The text was typewritten in formal black ink, detailing the immediate revocation of her remaining honorary titles and the formal demand to vacate the royal residence within 14 days. She read through the short paragraphs twice before lowering the paper to her side. The final institutional anchor had been severed cleanly, leaving her adrift in a reality governed entirely by unyielding accountability and public transparency. She walked back to the velvet sofa and set the parchment down beside the abandoned newspaper. The heavy silence of the room closed in around her once more, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock above the cold fireplace. Decades of carefully managed public appearances and backstage influence were reduced to a handful of legal notices resting on a mahogany table. The chapter was closed, and the legacy of the monarchy had finally turned toward a transparent future built on truth. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the most astonishing moments in modern royal history. The complete revelation of Diana's secret diaries on live television changed the British monarchy forever, proving that truth will always find a way to the surface. If you want to stay updated on more untold stories and historic investigations, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and we will see you in the next video.